Housekeeping behind, it's finally my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Ronald C. White, a historian and writer who has focused his work on using primary document research to really get to know the subjects of his biographies. He's written about Abraham Lincoln, Ulysses S. Grant, and recently about Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. I know from our colleagues at the Pejebska History Center that his book is the result of extensive research, and I'm very excited we have the opportunity to learn from this best-selling, award-winning author and historian tonight. Thank you for joining us, Ron. I know that everyone is cheering quietly at home behind their mute buttons, and we're really happy to have you. We'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you, Shannon, and thank you, Jody, for the invitation. We're transversing 3,000 miles. I'm in Pasadena, California, and 3 hours time change. But I said when we came on the air, I've become a Mainer in my several years of research and writing, and we'll celebrate my wife's birthday this August in Maine. Thank you again. As I prepared the manuscript for the Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain biography, I received a telephone call from Brunswick, Maine. The person who called was Nina Maurer. She'd been asked by the Pejebska History Center to rethink the dialogue, what the guides would do as they showed you the Chamberlain home. So I asked her the question, well, who comes to the Chamberlain home? And she said, well, about 60% of the people who come are great Chamberlain fans. And the other 40%, she said, have been wrangled in by their friends or relatives. So as I've spoken about Chamberlain in Maine or outside of Maine, some people are very familiar with him and are great fans, but other people are sort of saying, and who is Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain? Well, on the afternoon of July 2nd, 1863, as the back and forth Battle of Gettysburg waged on, the 20th Maine Volunteer Regiment received orders to defend the far left of the Union line. The colonel of the 20th Maine was 34-year-old Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. He stood 5 feet 10 and a half inches tall, handsome with a lean, strong build, sandy-colored hair, and in his own words, a ferocious mustache. His sparkling blue eyes conveyed a deep affection for the volunteers that he led. Yet I argue that he was an unlikely military hero. Mild-mannered, amiable, good-humored, Chamberlain was a professor at small Bowdoin College in far northern Maine. He was a man of deep Christian faith and intellectual curiosity. He was fluent, listen to this carefully, fluent in 9 languages. He interspersed his lectures with citations from the Bible, allusions to Athens and Rome, quotations from Dante and Goethe. No one would have predicted that this learned professor would become a confident Union officer, leading his men in the epic battle at Gettysburg. He was born only 50 years before the nation's founding, after the nation's founding, 1828. For Chamberlain, the idea of the Union was what animated him to fight in the Civil War. I think the concept of the Union is somewhat difficult for us to appreciate today. For him, it was not simply a political idea, it was a transcendent idea, almost a religious idea. At Gettysburg, he would need to draw upon every one of his gifts and abilities to defend this squatty hill called Little Round Top, facing a charge by the 15th Alabama, led by Colonel William Calvin Oates. Chamberlain, realizing that his men were falling low on ammunition, suddenly at this climactic moment offered but one word, bayonet, and his men charged down the hill and defeated this much larger force. Yet, I argue that in the vagaries of American memory, Chamberlain, the hero of Little Round Top, apart from Maine, literally fell forgotten in the early part of the 20th century. And then a remarkable trifecta took place. Michael Shara's Pulitzer Prize-winning novel, Killer Angels, Ken Burns' Civil War documentary, and Jeff Daniels portraying Chamberlain in the movie Gettysburg brought Chamberlain and his story to life to millions. If Chamberlain has been rediscovered, I believe that the narrative has basically been what I would call a zoom lens. it's focused almost exclusively on the Civil War. What I wanted to do in this biography was to do what I would call a wide-angle lens. I would argue that Chamberlain, perhaps more than any other Union veteran, even Ulysses S. Grant, occupied more different vocations. Think about it: professor, governor of Maine, elected 4 times, president of Bowdoin College, remarkable speaker, and great writer. Perhaps his finest book was actually published 1 year after his death, The Passing of the Armies. But actually, I quickly learned in attempting to do this biography that this was going to be a prickly task. What I mean by that is that there have been critics then, but especially now, who ask or argue, did Chamberlain exaggerate what he did? Did he even fabricate what took place at Gettysburg, or took place, as we'll see in a moment, in the surrender at Appomattox? As with the biographies of Lincoln and Grant, there are several things that kind of are part of the way I wish to do biographies. The first is, I think we skip much too quickly over the life of the young person. Ulysses S. Grant once said, the reason I don't read biographies is they don't tell me the story of the young person who becomes the adult leader. And I say to audiences, think about your own lives. You may be 40, 60, 80 today, but when you were 16, 18, 20, 22, were not those the years that the values of your life were deeply put in place by family, by church, by high school or college? This is true for Chamberlain. And the second part of the way I do biographies, I want to lift up what I call the faith story of the figures that I approach. I think we often again skip somewhat over this. Oh, this is what people thought and believed in the 19th century. So there's a profound faith story in Lincoln, a very much unknown faith story in Grant. I think the faith story of Chamberlain, his parents were really sort of 19th century versions of the older Puritanism that shaped New England, is really, really important to understand who he was. I'm also looking often for an episode that might have been forgotten in the early years, earlier biographies. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But also in approaching what I call the art of biography, I think there's often pieces of a puzzle that I want to explore. First, how do you understand the beneficiary of this wonderfully classic Bowdoin College education, who, when he becomes professor, actually challenges both the curriculum and the teaching methods? Secondly, how do you understand this amiable college professor who becomes this risk-taking Civil War soldier? So surprising. And to me, perhaps the most remarkable and intriguing part of the puzzle is Fanny, Frances Caroline Adams, the person who becomes his wife and partner. Let's begin with the beginning of the story. It's on a warm August day in Maine. A young boy is plodding across the family's farmland. He's leading 2 oxen, drawing a wagon heavily loaded with hay, and suddenly the wagon pitches. One wheel is stuck between 2 tree stumps. It cannot move forward. Clear the wheel! His father, walking behind the wagon, commands. How am I going to do it? The young boy replies. Do it! That's how! The father booms. And so the son grips the wheel, shoves with all of his young might, and finally, to his astonishment, the wagon lurches forward. Chamberlain would say over and over again that his father's words, do it, that's how, became a maxim for his entire life. He called it an order for life. Well, Chamberlain grew up in the village of Brewer, Maine, maybe 1,000 people at that time. His parents were deeply religious. In those days, the way one was nurtured in the Christian faith was by what we call catechesis. This is a form of teaching or learning that came down from the Protestant Reformation. So Chamberlain learned or memorized really the 107 question and answers of the Westminster Shorter Catechism. Question 1, what is the chief end of man? Answer 1, Man's chief end is to glorify God and enjoy him forever. I fear or worry that we've forgotten the beauty of memorization. Our children or grandchildren will say to us, I can look it up on Google. I was so pleased a few weeks ago when a father told me that his 6-year-old son had memorized the Gettysburg Address. It isn't just rote memory, it's part of the mind and the heart, so that at one moment as Chamberlain goes out for a difficult teaching assignment, he actually says to himself, fortified by the Westminster Confession. They gave him energy and courage. At age 19, he was off to Bowdoin College. Maine wanted to establish its own college because it was a 5-day horseback ride from Maine to Harvard in Massachusetts. He immersed himself in what then was a classical curriculum. People wanted to learn what the Romans and the Greeks taught. And I wondered, why would anybody want to make that the basis of the curriculum? And I found a quote from a Harvard professor in 1849. He said, what we need to do is to become Greeks. And then he railed against, and these are his words, a self-indulging age that tolerated a constant reference to self. Oh my goodness, is he talking about 2024 or 1848? A constant reference to self. Well, Chamberlain came to Bowdoin College with a physical disability that was very frightening. He was a stammerer or a stutterer. And in a kind of education that was really based on oration or recitation, this was a huge disability. It frightened him in his classes until a professor helped him overcome his stuttering and stammering. I've talked with a lot of stutterers and stammerers since writing this book, and they tell me you never completely overcome it, but he tried to do so. Another important event that took place while he was a student at Bowdoin College was the hiring of Calvin Stowe, an alumnus, to come back to the college to teach religion. Calvin Stowe's wife was Harriet Beecher Stowe. And one morning in the worship service at First Parish, she had literally a vision where she saw in her vision the plight of African-American slaves. She had lived previously in Cincinnati, and she'd interviewed some of these slaves who were attempting to escape from the South into the North or all the way into Canada. She went home, and writing at her kitchen table, she began to write what became Uncle Tom's Cabin. Well, on Saturday evenings, at the first, it was that her book was actually serialized in a magazine. She invited some students into her home. Chamberlain was one of those students. And he listened for the first time to the whole terrible story of slavery. This was his first encounter. I don't want to exaggerate how much this meant to him, but it was extremely important at the beginning of his college education. It was also at Bowdoin College that he met Fanny. Now, hers is a fascinating story, hard to appreciate in the 21st century. Frances Caroline Adams was born into a Boston family. She was the 7th child in her family. Her father was 50 years old enough to be her grandfather. And so the family did something that we would think extremely strange. He and his wife, her mother, decided that they would give Fanny to their younger cousin and his wife, who lived in Brunswick, the pastor of First Parish, so that she could grow up with younger parents. Well, Fanny was a bright, talented young girl, talented in painting and art. And towards the end of my research, I found this remarkable story about her, which I think says so much about who she was. She was a student at Brunswick High School. And if I can, I want to read this story. She was given an assignment by her teacher, Mr. Alfred Pike, who asked the students to compose a paper using the verbs ending in FY. Knowing that Mr. Pike did not entirely approve of her humor, she wrote, "This is to certify, notify, exemplify, testify, and signify my obedient disposition. And I hope that it will gratify, satisfy, beautify, and edify my teacher, and pacify, modify, and nullify his feelings of dissatisfaction towards me." Please do not exclaim, "Oh, fie," when reading this paper. I just think this story illustrates the kind of pluck of Fanny. But there's another side to her. If we were able to look at one of the early photographs, one of the great parts of the research was her stepfather kept a diary. And in his diary, he would often write, "Poor Fanny." He loved Fanny, but poor Fanny. Why? She was often prone to be in despair. She had headaches. She had a terrible problem with her eyes, which would render her blind at the end of her life. But she and Joshua Lawrence, his family always called him Lawrence, fell in love and they were married. Now, when I said there was a missing part of the story, when Chamberlain graduated from Bowdoin College, the question was, what will he do then? And here his parents were divided. His father wanted him to go to West Point. In those days, you could go to West Point after you graduated from college. His mother wanted him to be a minister or missionary. Whether he took his mother's advice or just decided this on his own, he went to Bangor Theological Seminary, established in 1814. This is the missing part of the story. He went for a full 3 years, graduated with a degree, and was invited to serve in 2 churches, one of them in Belfast, Maine. But at the same moment, Bowdoin College approached him and said, "If you are willing to give an address at our annual commencement, we'll offer you a Master of Arts degree." Evidently, the address was so wonderful, the next day they offered him a teaching contract. And because he did not become an ordained minister, in all the previous biographies, those 3 years got at most 2 sentences. Well, I've been the dean of a theological seminary, and I know that many people then and now go to seminary today, not to necessarily become ordained ministers, but they just want the benefit of a theological education. So I thought there must be something more to be told about these 3 years than 2 sentences. The problem, Bangor Theological Seminary went out of business in 2013. Where were the records? I was so fortunate. I arrived at the Maine Historical Society in Portland just after they had received the records and had cataloged them. And so rather than 2 sentences, I devote a full chapter to what happened in those 3 years. I think, again, it's part of his formation, the person he became, the leader that he became. He enjoyed those 3s immensely. Well, the Civil War broke out in April of 1861 with the firing on Fort Sumter. I learned from John Cross, another great help to me, the alumni secretary at Bowdoin College, that there were no electives in those days, so Chamberlain would have taught literally every student who enlisted in the Union Army. He listened, he corresponded with them, some were captured, several were killed. On July 1st, 1863, Lincoln offered a proclamation saying we need 300,000 more men to serve in the Union Army. 13 days later, Chamberlain wrote to the governor of Maine, Israel Washburn, "I fear this war, so costly in blood and treasure, will not cease until men of the North are willing to leave good positions and sacrifice their dearest personal interests." Duty was a great virtue, a masculine virtue in the 19th century. So Washburn offered Chamberlain a colonelcy. He would be the leader of a regiment. And then I think this says so much about who he is. He said, "No, I don't want to accept that." And these were his words, "I will take the subordinate position and learn and earn my way to the command." Well, the person who led the 20th Maine was a West Pointer, also a Mainer, Delbert Ames. He was 26 years old. Chamberlain was 33 years old. The men hated Ames. They actually wrote they hoped he'd be the first casualty in their first battles because he was a strict disciplinarian. But Chamberlain was willing to learn from this man 7 years younger about what it meant to be a leader in the Union Army. Well, 10 months after Gettysburg, he was involved in the battle at Petersburg. And as he was leading his men down the hill, suddenly he was struck in his left hip by a minie ball. that went through his body, splattered his blood vessels, his urethra, his bladder, and stuck inside of his right hip. Soldiers, physicians today would say he had a 10% chance of survival. He believed that he would die. The two doctors who attended him told him he would die. And then he wrote this remarkable letter to his wife. I'm just overwhelmed by this letter. If you were to go to the special collections in the Bowdoin College library, you would see this letter. This is what he wrote. My darling wife, I am lying mortally wounded, the doctors think, but my mind and heart are at peace. Jesus Christ is my all-sufficient Savior. I go to him. God bless and comfort you, precious one. You have been a precious wife to me. To know and love you makes life and death beautiful. Cherish the darlings, they had 2 young children, and give my love to all the dear ones. Do not grieve too much for me. We shall all soon meet. Live for the children. I just can't get over that letter. It just sparks emotion in me. But quickly, fortunately, his younger brother Tom went to the 20th Maine and found 2 surgeons unknown to Chamberlain who came and removed the bullet from his right hip. If you visit the Chamberlain home, the bullet is right there. You can see it. But Chamberlain, for the rest of his life, dealt with what recent scholars have called invisible wounds. Those familiar with the Civil War are aware of all the amputations, which were visible wounds, terrible visible wounds. Chamberlain had 3 different surgeries, but he could never, ever finally repair this wound. He had to deal with infections from this wound all through his life. The infections finally took his life at the end. Well, there's one more remarkable Civil War story. It took place at Appomattox 10 months later. The war has come to an end. Grant has offered a remarkable, magnanimous peace to Lee, and Chamberlain, not a West Pointer, not part of the regular army, is asked to lead the surrender of the Confederate troops. Now, this has been what it gets prickly. This is where some of the critics weigh in. Well, why in the world would Chamberlain be asked? There's no written order. But my mentor at Princeton University, the great Civil War historian, Jim McPherson, has said, hey, everything wasn't written down in the last 24 to 48 hours of the Civil War. It's completely possible that this was an oral order given to Chamberlain. So now get into your imagination what might have taken place. General John B. Gordon was asked to lead the Confederate surrender. He, like Chamberlain, was not a West Pointer, but he had risen in the estimation of Robert E. Lee. His men called Gordon the Gallant, and so he's asked to come forward. After 4 years of war, you could try to imagine what must have been in the hearts of these Confederate soldiers. So as Gordon and his men approached, only 3 to 4 yards separated the blue and gray lines. And then Chamberlain, perhaps thinking of what Grant had done, wanted to offer some kind of recognition, not to the Confederacy or to the cause, but to the bravery and courage of these men in the ragged uniforms approaching him. And so when they got directly opposite him, he ordered his command to bring their muskets from what's called order arms to carry arms, the marching salute. Chamberlain saluted the former enemies. Gordon was overwhelmed by this gesture. He later called it a token of respect. Well, Chamberlain comes home to Maine. He is forever after the hero of Little Round Top. They always call him General. I forgot to say there at Petersburg, when the word went up to Grant that Chamberlain was dying, Grant did something he'd never done before. He put what he called on the spot. He promoted Chamberlain to general so that his family and friends would know of the regard of Grant and the Union Army. So Chamberlain returns to Maine. Republicans recognize that here is the hero of Little Round Top. They nominate him to be governor. He serves the first term. The second term, I kind of did a calculation. unusual Maine Constitution of that time was you served a one-year term, and the average length of service was really just a year and a half. But Chamberlain served one term, two terms, three terms, four terms, quite remarkable. I think it was a difficult time, although he himself was a person who was not known to be much of a person who used alcohol. He ran into a conflict with a huge temperance movement because he didn't want to simply affirm what they wanted. He recognized they had a large, different constituency, many Roman Catholic immigrants who were not into temperance, and he didn't believe that any one group could tell some other group how they ought to act and behave. Well, we could talk more about his governorship, but let me just say then he was elected president of Bowdoin College, and he served there for 12 years. It's interesting what took place in these colleges after the Civil War. Chamberlain gave an inaugural address at Bowdoin College, and this is what he said. In accepting what he called a commission, he believed the times had, his words, shot past the college. Left out of the current of living sympathies, she stood still, while the world at full flood and flushed with new lives swept on. He told his audience the college had touched bottom. So he asked two questions: how to rise again, how to begin. And he said, well, there's two ways we could do this. We might confine our efforts chiefly to holding our own, strengthening the things that remain, and feel our way by cautious and imperceptible degrees. The second way would be to accept the challenge of our times. He put the question in very bold language: should the college conquer or should it die? Well, all alumni often want a college to change, but not really to change. They remember the way it was in their day. So the big change that Chamberlain wanted to bring in was the study of science. Remember, this is the last third of the 19th century. Science was the great current of intellectual thought, and he wanted to bring science into the curriculum. But this is where he ran into difficulty. Many people in their very traditional Christian faith were worried that science somehow would be a detriment or be a challenge to that faith. So Chamberlain, after 2 years, realized he wasn't getting any place. He resigned. But the overseers and trustees, there were two boards at Bowdoin way into the end of the 20th century, they refused to accept his resignation. Then Chamberlain did something that we often think was unique, but it really wasn't. After the Civil War, people began thinking, we were not prepared for the Civil War. What if another war comes? Will we be prepared? And they believed that the young men growing up in their day were soft and not really ready. So Bowdoin College did what 20 other colleges had done. They instituted a military drill process. And at first, the young men in the college, and of course, there's only young men until the end of the 20th century when young women were enrolled. At first, they thought this was wonderful, but then they began to rebel. Are we becoming a military college? Is this taking too much of our time? And this became a huge controversy for Chamberlain. Often he alone is associated with what's called the drum drill rebellion. I wanted to point out that actually the faculty and the boards, two boards, were involved in this too. And so suddenly, a year later, the boys begin to say, we are not going to participate. So Chamberlain writes this letter to each of the parents of these boys and says, if you do not participate, you will be expelled from the college. You need to decide. Well, all but three accepted those terms. That became a huge part. Chamberlain resigns again. But once again, the board refuses to accept his resignation. He goes on to serve 12 years, but then he's still in his 50s. He has a minuscule military pension, no pension from the governorship, no pension from the college. What will he do? He thinks he will try his hand in business. Florida is just being developed as a new place in the South. Florida was looking for men of the North who had some sort of stature to be the presidents of various real estate or development companies. And so Chamberlain is invited to become the head of one of these companies. So he spends the next 10 years doing things in Florida and also with an office in West Point, on Wall Street, pardon me. And this is what he tries to do, but he's not successful. Willie's, the son in the family, writes a remarkable letter at the end of the next decade to his mother saying, you know, our man can't be, I'm telling you something you knew a long time ago, our man can't be successful in everything. The problem is he's always willing to look out for the other fella instead of himself. But let me conclude with this particular story, which I think is even a more remarkable story than the story of Little Round Top. We have all been living through the unexpected reality that somehow there is not necessarily what we always thought was true, a peaceful transfer of power from one election to the next. And we've been told this had never happened before in American history. Well, actually, it did happen before, not in a national election, but in a state election. It took place in Maine. So in the end of 1879, there is the election for governor. Actually, there was a Democratic governor at that time, but Republicans were usually in the ascendancy. And in September of 1879, the election takes place, and it appears that the Republicans have won the election handily. They've won the governorship, they've won the House, they've won the Senate. But then what begins to be called the Great Countout starts. The Secretary of State, who is a Democrat, begins to disqualify the ballots and therefore count out those who were elected. In one town, 5 representatives and 1 senator lost their seats because the results were not signed in an open town meeting. In another, 5 representatives were eliminated because the candidates were listed with initials, not their full names. The voters in another town were disqualified because the ballot was printed in 2 columns rather than 1. In another town, 2 representatives were counted out because of misspelling of their names. In Portland, 143 votes were thrown out. In Lewiston, Saco, Bath, and Rockland, all the votes were dismissed because 3 aldermen instead of 4 aldermen signed the returns. Republican anger spread across the state. The Bangor, Whig, and Courier headline blared, "The conspiracy! Revolution actually afoot! Only awaiting the final act! Will they dare to commit the monstrous crime?" Men began marching towards Augusta. Insurgency was in the air. They came with rifles. Governor Garcelon, worried about the anger, ordered 120 rifles and 20,000 rounds of ammunition moved from the arsenal in Bangor to Augusta. He assembled a paramilitary force to defend the State House, which the Portland Daily Press called Fort Garcelon. As 1880 dawned, with a new governor slated to be sworn in on January 7, Garcelon wrote to the one man in Maine, a Republican, who he believed could quell this dangerous situation, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. His order, Major General Joshua Chamberlain, is authorized and directed to protect the public property and institutions of the state until my successor is duly qualified. Duty called once more. Chamberlain arrived in Augusta on January 5. He found the State House barricaded with heavy wood planks. He entered and established himself in a small office. He now became the military governor of the state. In his unanticipated position, he decided to keep clear of all civilian political decisions. He did not have the authority to determine which of the counted out lawmakers made up the legal governing legislature. But in these last days of January, that didn't stop all sides from ratcheting up the pressure on him. He wrote to Fanny, "Everything is confusion here." He tried to assure her, "Although I succeeded yesterday in getting a good many awkward things straightened out, what vexes me is that some of our own people, Republicans, do not like me to straighten things out." 2 days later, he wrote Fanny again, "I do not dare to leave here a moment. This would most assuredly be a coup d'etat, ending in violence and bloodshed. I'm impressed by a letter by Portland, United States Congressman Thomas Reed. He offered a portrait of Chamberlain in this turmoil. The resplendent figure shining like one of the suns of the morning, which has brought us this tranquil joy, is the figure of Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. He described Chamberlain as one who walks the State House stairs, master of the situation. In a January 15 letter to Fanny, Lawrence confided to her of a bitter attack upon him, calling him a traitor. He even heard of threats to her. If you're afraid, he told her to contact Thomas Eaton, a local police officer, to have the police keep an eye on you in the house. On a particular frantic day, the mayor of Augusta told Chamberlain men were rushing towards the Capitol armed, an insurgency. He stepped to the rotunda of the Capitol, surrounded by Union battle flags, and this is what he said: "Men, you wish to kill me, I hear. Killing is no new thing to me. I've offered myself to be killed many times when I no more deserved it than I do now. Some of you, I think, have been with me in those days. You understand what you want, do you? I'm here to preserve the peace and honor of this state until the right government is seated, whichever it may be. It's not for me to say, but it is for me to see that the laws of this state are put into effect without fraud, without force, but with calm thought and sincere purpose. I'm here for that, and I shall do it. If anybody wants to kill me for it, here I am, let him kill." And with these words, he opened his coat and challenged this insurrectionist mob. Witnessing this event, Nelson Dingley, a former governor, wrote, "There was a breathless silence for a moment. Then a veteran in the crowd thundered, 'By God, old general, the first man that dares to lay a hand on you, I'll kill him on the spot.' And the crowd drifted away." In 1880, I argue, Chamberlain had given hundreds of speeches in which there were thundering applause with persons on their feet, but he'd never given a speech like that one. For Chamberlain, it was really a near reprisal of Little Round Top. In fact, he wrote Fanny the next day, "Yesterday was another Round Top." On January 16, the Maine Supreme Court offered its ruling. It declared the actions to count out or decertify the votes unconstitutional. The court validated unanimously the election of a Republican governor, a Republican House, and a Republican Senate. The so-called 12 days in January were over. After these days, Chamberlain received a cascade of letters. Dennis Shapley, remembering his participation in the surrender to Appomattox, wrote, "General Chamberlain, we were never so proud of you as now, not even when you stood upon the boundary lines and received the surrender of our vanquished foe." 12 days in January, I think, may have been his finest moment. Let me close with these words. There's so many great words of Chamberlain. You can find these words on the Bowdoin College campus. They were actually spoken at the 1889 reunion of the 20th Maine when they dedicated monuments at Little Round Top. I think they say so much about Chamberlain. "In great deeds, something abides. On great fields, something stays. Forms change and pass, bodies disappear, but spirits linger to consecrate the ground for the vision place of souls. And reverent men and women from afar, and generations that know us not, and that we know not of, heart drawn to see where and by whom great things were suffered and done for them, shall come to this deathless field to ponder and dream." Shannon, as I've delivered a similar address across the country, I thought originally I was writing a Civil War biography or maybe a 19th century biography, but my audience has spoken back to me and said, what you're really talking about is the kind of values we need today, the kind of leaders we need today. And that's why Chamberlain is so important. Of course, he's a 19th century person. He dies actually in 1914, just on the eve of the First World War. But his fame now has become so important. He's the reason people visit Little Round Top today, because I think what he represents is what we most desire in our leaders today. Thank you very much. I'm pleased to answer questions and hear any comments.
Thank you so much. I know if we were all in an auditorium together, you'd get some applause. That was really interesting. Folks, are there any questions to throw in the chat? Go ahead, and I'm here to read any. Oh, okay, here we go right away. Right away, we have one that says, great program. Did Chamberlain's failures in business and issues in marriage contribute to his gravitating with such resolve to commemoration of the war, remembering its defining moments in his life and sacrifice to preserve the Union?
That's a great question. I did not speak about the difficulties of his marriage. That's another topic that we should talk about. Someone has actually said, my mentor and professor said, you've really written a biography of a marriage. You know, I don't know about that. I think the story of the business is probably somewhat unknown. I just think it's sort of the vagaries of memory. I mean, actually, there were two different guidebooks written about Gettysburg in the 30s and 40s that don't even mention Chamberlain. So it's not unusual that we forget people. It's hard for me to understand why we did forget him. I don't think he was ever forgotten in Maine, but I think he was not really fully recognized across the nation. And now, because of his great fame, I think he's becoming a very well-known figure. Thank you for that question.
Jody, did you want to jump in or?
Oh, thank you, Ron. This has been fantastic. I guess I'm wondering, you've written so many biographies of some really important people. I wonder how this kind of compares with some of the other subjects you've studied.
Thank you for that question. Well, you might think that obviously writing about Lincoln and Grant might be more important. I actually think I might say I enjoyed this more than any. I just found him such a remarkable figure. And the values, I mean, the education he received, his leadership, and it's kind of fun to allow people who don't know about someone to learn about him. In doing this across the country, I can't tell you how many people have said, well, I went to Bowdoin College, or my daughter's going to Bowdoin College, my son is going to Bowdoin College. So that's been a great thing. I've enjoyed this immensely. And this time, actually the second time, I've actually had the privilege of doing the audio book. And so that was a great opportunity. Not that I'm in any way critical of previous audio books, but I think the author doing the audio book, you sort of know what really is important, how really to emphasize something. And I've not been an audiobook fan, but I've been listening to audiobooks, and I understand Lincoln often said we should read with two senses, the sense of the eye and the sense of the ear. And today we mostly read with the sense of the eye, and the sense of the ear is important. And one of the emphases that I make in this book, that Chamberlain himself was a great public speaker. And so I wanted to lift that up as part of the biography. And that was a great joy to talk about. So thank you for that question.
Next question is, while you were doing your research, was there anything that was particularly surprising to you?
Well, I've suggested already that the 3 years at Bangor Seminary was surprising. I should give a little context for that. Until the 19th century, the way ministers were trained, something of the way lawyers were trained, you went to Harvard or Yale, and then you lived with a settled minister who taught you, in a sense, the arts, the practical aspects of ministry. So seminaries were a brand new phenomenon in the 19th century. So that was quite interesting. Another thing that surprised me is what I call the Second Civil War. I argue that the first Civil War was fought with guns. The Second Civil War was fought with words. And so initially, after the Civil War, all of these men were great heroes, but then they began to say, no, it didn't happen that way. Actually, it happened this way. Oh, no, no. So when Chamberlain gets to that 1889 celebration, the men of the 20th Maine had been arguing who did what when. And I thought in a remarkable way, he said to them, you're all right. You are all right. He didn't want these disagreements to fester and divide that regiment. So that was another mark of his leadership that I found quite something.
How about this? Do you know if Chamberlain had contact with William Pitt Fessenden?
Yes, William Pitt Fessenden was the was a senator from Maine in the great impeachment controversy over President Johnson. Fessenden, who was an anti-slavery person, took what may have been the critical vote, a surprising vote, to vote against the impeachment of Johnson, which literally destroyed his career, destroyed him as a person. And it may be surprising to learn that Chamberlain agreed with Fessenden. As much as Chamberlain despised Andrew Johnson, he did not believe that what Johnson had done had risen to, this is a contemporary debate, isn't it, had risen to the high crimes and misdemeanors. So Chamberlain was quite knowledgeable of, I'm not quite sure if you would say friendship with, but he was sympathetic to Fessenden and his point of view. And many, many, many years later, Fessenden's son sent to Chamberlain a letter in the early 20th century, early 19th century, in which he said, "This is a letter I found in my father's papers, and I think you'd like to hear it now." And it was a letter from Fessenden really praising Chamberlain, and Chamberlain wrote back to his son and said, "You know, this means more to me now than if I would have received it during the Civil War." So Fessenden had a great admiration for Chamberlain.
Ron, we have another question about the town of Chamberlain in Bristol, which is supposedly named for Chamberlain. Do you know how that came about?
Afraid I don't. Maybe you can tell me. I don't know how that came about.
Maybe someone in our audience knows
Yeah,
that.
let me know. Sure,
I'm not familiar with that story.
sure.
If anyone knows, we will give you a second to unmute yourself and tell us.
Right.
Hello? Can you
Hi.
hear me?
Yes, James.
James will know.
Go ahead, James.
Jim lives in Chamberlain, so he probably
Oh,
answer to
he
this.
must know.
Okay. We're not hearing you, Jim. So maybe drop us an email afterwards and let us know. Seems like maybe his volume's out. Let's see, there was another question in here. Folks, it looks like we might have time for a couple more questions. So if you have something you're wondering, go ahead and throw it in there. This question is, Ron, what did Chamberlain himself have to say about accepting the surrender? Did he have anything to say about that?
He did, and this is part of the dilemma that he said something about it maybe 6 different times. You know, he lived a long time, and so some of the critics have said, well, he said one occasion he said this, and another occasion he said that. I failed to say that as I tried to understand the surrender, I went to Appomattox, spent a day there with Patrick Schroeder, the park historian who spent 25 years investigating this story and shared with me much of his research. Because the critics say that this was not spoken about until years later. That's completely untrue. It was not only spoken about in a letter to his wife the next day, but Patrick Schroeder showed me it was spoken about in 3 different newspapers within the next several months, in which it said Joshua Chamberlain led the surrender. So he tells that story, and John B. Gordon went on to become a very famous leader in the South. And in 1893, he gave a lecture in Brooklyn. And the New York Times reported this story. He asked Chamberlain and several Union generals to sit behind him on the stage. And when he got to the story of Appomattox, he told the story, told of Chamberlain's role, and suddenly turned and said, "And here is the gentleman, would you please stand, who offered this magnanimous surrender." So they had a same sort of story. It wasn't that one and the other had a different story. So I'm very convinced that this is an authentic story, and there's much evidence to show that it is.
Ron, I'm curious. You mentioned that while he was president of Bowdoin, there was the controversy about the curriculum.
Yes.
And I was curious, as a student, I mean, and he was obviously a scholar of the languages and the classics, and yet obviously he appreciated and wanted to move them towards the sciences. Is this something that sort of came about because of his experience in the war, or do you know? I'm just curious about, sort of the switch in his philosophy.
Well, that's a wonderful question. It gives me the opportunity to say that on the one hand, Chamberlain was himself quite traditional in his Christian faith, we might say sort of an Orthodox faith, but he didn't see science as in any way a challenge to that faith. In fact, what I did discover was he took for himself to give every single baccalaureate address. So although he is not an ordained minister, the baccalaureate address is literally a sermon. And one of the first ones he did, he always asked a question, what's the relationship of science and religion? And he saw no deep contention or controversy between the two. At his memorial service in 1914, the then president of Bowdoin College said, now when we look back, what Chamberlain attempted to do, even though he had his critics, is what we fully accept as a progressive kind of education. Chamberlain was way ahead of his time. Sadly, we didn't understand that. Now we fully want science to be part of our curriculum, and it is. So the impetus to do that, I think Chamberlain wanted to be in touch with the modern currents of thought. This was part of his, what I would call his intellectual curiosity. You can be a devout Christian and you can have intellectual curiosity. The two are not in conflict with each other.
Interesting. So we're about close to end of time here. Jody's going to wrap us up with one last question, and I know everyone will be interested in hearing the answer.
Actually, we have two questions.
Oh, two. Okay. Okay, sure. Yes.
Quick ones, because I know we have to wrap up. Someone wants to know where they can purchase your books, Ron. Very important.
Well, I like to really plug independent bookstores. So please try to do that in an independent bookstore in Maine or wherever you are. You can obviously get it another place, but I would plug the independent bookstore. Yeah.
Great. And of course, we want to know what you're working on now.
Yes. What I'm working on now is what I'm calling Unprecedented, the Third Act of John Quincy Adams. He is the only person who ever retired from the presidency and returned to serve 17 years in Congress. And his presidency was not successful. He was bashed by Andrew Jackson in his bid for re-election. I think his 17 years in Congress are what I call his third act. And I want to argue that people today in their 60s and 70s and 80s also have a third act. And he's the poster child for having a very successful third act. So I'm having a lot of fun getting started. I'll be a lot of work at the Massachusetts Historical Society. He kept an amazing diary, which, fortunate for me in Pasadena, California, is all digitized. So I'm really having fun with John Quincy Adams.
Great.
That sounds great. I think this is a good place to end. Thank you, Jody, for the collaboration, and thank you, Ron, so much. This was really interesting.
Thank you so much for the